Welcome back everyone, and in today's video lesson we are going to look at compound intervals. Before we do that though, let's go ahead and get some terminology straightened out. So the first term that we want to know is simple interval. And so hopefully you know what interval is. It's just really the distance between two tones. And for simple interval, it's going to be notes that are considered to be less than or equal to an octave. So that would be anything up to and including an 8, right? Simple interval will be less than or equal to an 8. All right. And a compound interval, which then, if I do a compound interval, is going to be anything that is greater than an octave. And so that's just going to be greater than 8, right? So this is 9 and above. So if I keep that numbering system up, then I would have 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, right? So on and so forth. And you might notice some things here. And so you'll start noticing, well, wait a minute, a 1 is the same thing as an 8, is the same thing as a 15. And that's true. And you could do the same thing with all of your 2s, 9s, and 16s, and so on and so forth. You could do it with all of them, right? And so that's kind of the idea of compound intervals, is they give us a way of talking very specifically about intervals that are larger than an octave. For example, if I said, well, I want you to play C to D, well, 99.9% of us would think he said C to D. But if I used, well, hey, I want you to play a ninth, you go, he said C to D. So I didn't say the same thing there. Now, there's a little bit of interesting stuff that comes up with this because it also has to do with how we interpret. So in general, in something like classical music, we will tend to use the full interval name, a major 27th or something like that, a major 15th. Those are things that will come up. But for the rest of the world, we tend to use just simple intervals, right? We don't really tend to use a lot of these compound intervals. We do use them occasionally, but when do we use them? And that's a really interesting question. So we use them usually for 9s, 11s, and 13s. And let's kind of think about, well, why do we use them for 9s, 11s, and 13s? So first off, a 9 is really the same thing as, hopefully you can see this, it's the same thing as, a 9 is the same thing as 2. An 11 is the same thing as 4. And a 13 is going to be the same thing as 6. I use this term same thing, right? I'm going to kind of think about those in quotes, like air quotes, right? Like the same thing. They're not quite the same thing, but we can use it almost interchangeably. So let's think about why they're not really the same thing. Well, obviously, I mentioned earlier that a 9 is really talking about this C to this specific D. It's not this C to this D. That's different. But by that same token, when we think about certain instruments like guitar, well, guitar, you don't have the option to play notes linearly. Guitar is a paradoxal instrument. And so oftentimes they just think of the notes in whatever order they can find them, and they really don't care about order. So it really has to do with the context that you're dealing with things. Like I said, in classical music, where there's more sort of instrumental separation, right? You have more components, more people playing more different parts. You really need to be specific about, well, what exact interval are we talking about? Versus guitar is really like a harmonic instrument where you're meant to sort of play lead and harmony kind of all at the same time, or you're able to at least. And so in that respect, you are able to sort of mix these intervals up. So in that respect, a lot of times if somebody said, play a 9, they just said, hey, you know what? Play C to D. And in terms of guitar, you really don't care whether it's this C to this D, this C to this D, this C to this D. Just get a C to D in there somewhere. Okay, so that's what it means in terms of that real world kind of application at that point, okay, for guitar and whatnot. Now let's think about, let's say if somebody said play an 11. And so we have that same idea. If somebody said play an 11, what they're really saying is, well, hey, take your initial interval, your initial starting point, and just play some kind of a fourth. C to F, C to this F, C to this F. It really doesn't matter, just as long as we get a C to F in there somewhere. That's what we really consider. And I know that sounds kind of fuzzy in terms of logic, but if you understood how guitar is a paradoxal instrument, how it literally is impossible to get the notes in order, then it would make more sense. Now, piano is a linear instrument, and it is possible to get the notes in order. However, sometimes it doesn't make sense to, and so we tend to still mix them up even so. All right, what we end up having is we have the notes 1 through 8, really 1 through 8. And then we have 9s, 11s, and 13s. So in that respect, if somebody mentions a 10 or a 12 to you, what you really want to be able to do is simply just convert. You want to be able to take in your head to go, oh, well, he said 10. Well, 10 is the same thing as a 3, or a 12 is the same thing as a 5, so on and so forth. Or a 14 is the same thing as a 7. Okay, so that's kind of the idea that you want to do there. You want to be able to convert those notes in your head. You want to understand that a simple interval is less than 8, so by its technical definition, it's going to be less than or equal to an octave. A compound interval is going to be greater than an octave, but in reality, we face a lot of difficult challenges in doing that, and so we tend to ignore that rule. And so when we talk about chord structures, later on, you're going to hear me mention things like 9s, 11s, and 13s, and I don't mean that 9s, 11s, and 13s must be in that order, just as long as you get, well, technically a 2, a 4, or a 6. So one last final point then, why don't we talk about intervals in terms of, well, why can't I just call a 9 a 2 then? Or an 11 a 4? Why can't I just call a 13 a 6? And the reason why is because music is tertian based. Tertian based, right? Meaning it's third based. Everything's based on thirds. So the way that we structure chords, and we haven't gotten there yet, but the way that we structure chords in music is we basically build everything on thirds. So we have, when we build a chord, we'll have a third, some kind of 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 a... And that's how we basically build our music. So you can see, as I do this, here's a third, 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 and it repeats and it starts over. So there's no point in talking about things, in a sense, past a 13 for this respect, because we end up, if we keep using that third system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, on that 8th third, so to speak, we end up repeating ourselves. Okay, so that's why we don't really consider calling a 9 an actual 2, because it's not tertian based. If I called a 9 a 2, then it's a 2. It's secundal base, secondary base, right? It's not tertian based anymore. So that's compound and simple intervals.